Okay. And I think I first met you or came across you like 8, 10 years ago. And it strikes me the trauma world has changed massively since then.
It has.
You know what I mean? It's really
Yeah.
become a big
Yeah.
world, a lot of
Yeah.
systems and a lot of complexity,
Yes.
and people are kind of rock stars in that world.
Yeah.
And I love, you've been in this world for a while. You've been doing this since you were 20 years old, you said. So I guess that's a little while. So yeah. I mean, I know it's, I'm not going to say how many years, but that's a while. So what have you seen? How long?
45. I'm 65.
45 years. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So you must have seen a lot change, things come and
That's
go.
right.
I mean, working in trauma longer than I've been alive. So like, tell us about that. That's like a huge amount of experience I think we should all hear about.
The whole change in how.
Yeah. What have you seen come and go? What have you seen, change? How have you seen, how is that being part of that world? Like just opening that up.
Yeah. Well, if I go back to, I started in bodywork when I was 20, which is in the middle of the 70s, 75 to 78. And the psychotherapy world back then was, it was really about opening up. A lot of it was cathartic.
Yep, very screaming, shouting.
A lot of it was, that's where Janov's primal therapy was around. That's where, and so there was this huge belief in that what we needed was to set the body free, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which basically is releasing tension. Set it free, express emotions, express them loudly, right? That was the belief. And that's also, I was part of lots of experiments back then in different types of psychotherapy. We were a group of people from this psychomotor school who went to workshops together. So I have been in that whole
jump, screaming, shouting, throwing up in bucket.
And looking back, I can see that it probably, some of it was fun, some of it was terrible, some of it didn't make any difference, but in the long run, I do think it has prolonged my own trauma therapy process.
Okay, right.
Because it strengthened the split in me between the parts of me that could join into this, let's go for it, right? Mm-hmm. And part of me can do that. Part of me has energy enough to do that. But what has been the deepest challenge for me within my own trauma patterns, they have been lying in the hypo side. And there wasn't really knowledge back then in trauma therapy about that.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, that's my personal reason for having started focusing on it. It was that something was missing, that no matter how much I went into running and expressing, and then I was still left with that a while later, I would drop into a deep collapse again. And then I would fight my way out because I'm not the type of person who wants to look like a loser, who wants to, so I have been fighting that side. And I do think that's not only me personally. I think that's how it worked back then. It's that we started, trauma therapy started as a split system, where a lot of work was done with the hyper side. And the hypo side wasn't seen or acknowledged or understood. That also was inspired by or supported by that most of the trauma research was done with homecoming soldiers from the Vietnam War and other.
Yeah, that was the sort of genesis of PTSD.
That was a big surge in the PTSD research, but it means that it was done with male soldiers primarily, and their types of trauma patterns.
Right, and that's not an average cross section of people, right?
No, it's not, and it's
trauma.
not, and it's not the group of people where you will meet most hypoarousal.
Right, yeah, okay.
Hypoarousal is more common in women than in men.
Okay.
And more common in other types of trauma than you find with soldiers.
Makes sense. Yeah, I don't hear people talk about gender differences much in trauma. It's not something I hear people talk about much.
No, but they are there.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you can go to, there are different people who have addressed it. Ruth Lanius, Bruce Perry, have addressed it. Yeah, those are the ones that come to my mind right now.
Thank you. If this might be something to point me towards I haven't seen much of. And what about the teaching side of it? So we're in this crazy situation now where trauma teachers, I've seen trauma go from taboo, like I'm not traumatized, no one's traumatized. People that were clearly traumatized used to say, I'm not traumatized. And then, and then the teachers were these sort of weird, obscure people. And, that had this sort of maybe unhealthy interest in the dark side of life. And then now the trauma teachers are sort of global megastars, Some of them I found are quite nice. Some of them aren't so much, I've found on the other side of things. And also that everyone's traumatized now. Everyone's talking about trauma all the time. It's not just like abuse survivors or war veterans that have trauma now. It's middle-class girls who got the wrong kind of chocolate, It's so the world's really changed in its approach to trauma, for better and maybe a little bit for worse.
Yeah. You could say there's with trauma, you can, if you look at it at a spectrum, you can have two extreme ways of looking at trauma. One is called trauma centrality, which I think is what you a little humorously point to. That we can, in a way, we can get over-identified with our trauma.
I'm a survivor.
Yeah. This is who I am.
Becomes a big thing.
I am my trauma, and I become somebody by being traumatized. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's actually a quite serious state, or it's a serious syndrome.
Okay.
And the research shows that it worsens PTSD.
Okay, because people identify with it. And I see people identify with other conditions, alcoholism, ADHD, autism. I've heard people get, so people that are sort of into their condition, it becomes part of their identity.
Kind of stuck with it.
Yeah, because it's part of who you are, right? So how are you going to lose that?
Yes. And it's hard to work with. But that's one end of the extreme of how we can relate to trauma. Mm. The other end is denial.
Right. Yeah.
Which,
no one's
also pointed to that. I'm not traumatized. Nothing wrong with me. Or minimizing, or avoiding, or and in that spectrum also lies the aspect of dissociation where you detach from it.
Yeah.
Many aspects
I've ever met that trauma has always said, "Yeah, but I didn't have it so bad." It's like, well, my brother was beaten up more. I've been like, well, you were still beaten up by your dad. It was still pretty heavy.
Yeah. So you have these two ends of the spectrum. And I mean, it's a really good question, what it is that supports us in getting a more realistic view on what trauma is, how it shows up, and what it is we can do about it.
There's also been the shift of trauma had to be from a certain event to trauma as a state of the nervous system, or in your case, the muscular system as well, right? That seems to have been a shift. People are like, okay, PTSD, you have to have a threat to life or limb, integrity yourself. Now it's like, it's not so much about the external, it's more about how you're sort of wired, the nervous system. Neuroscience obviously advanced a lot in that time. Yeah,
and I'm certainly in that boat. I'm not, when I work, I'm the first long time, I'm not especially interested in the events. I'm very interested in what skills are available. Mm-hmm. How can we widen? How can we build up resilience? How can we get access to more more experience of agency, more experience of inner authority, of that I am actually in charge myself. I'm not decided over by my arousal states. I can relate to them. Right? How do we support that?
So resources, states.
Yeah.
The third thing I've seen recently, which I used to really push for, and now I'm not sure about, is the politicization of trauma. Maybe trauma's always had this element, but I think it was 3 years ago, I was at a conference and in London, big one, good one. And there was several very famous trauma speakers there, some of the most famous in the world. And all three of the top speakers all mentioned positive Donald Trump. And they mentioned him in a fairly negative way. And I can get why. He's not my favorite person either. But I thought, okay, this is really interesting that there are psychologists talking about politics. And since then, and I thought in some ways I thought it was quite positive at the time. And since then, certainly even in the last few months, it's just exploded, like the connection between politics and trauma. Almost like trauma is being weaponized by certain political groups. It's being used or maybe abused by certain political groups to say, well, therefore we have to have these politics, or because you don't understand trauma, you're a bad person. But I'm seeing it used in a whole new way, particularly in the States, but to some extent here.
That's interesting.
You not come across this?
Well, you could say, if I think trauma and politics, I start earlier. So I'll just add that, because trauma in a way has always related to politics.
True. Yeah.
From the very beginning, if you go down to the early days with Freud and Janet and Charcot in Paris, and you had these two French, Janet and Charcot, who worked with the prostitutes, women from the streets, and worked with all their dissociative symptoms, and they were very aware of that they were working with real life events. That these women had been abused sexually, violently, etc., and they had dissociative symptoms because of that. Right? In the beginning, Freud joined that, and then at some point he left that and went into this whole interpretation of that these symptoms were a sign of the Oedipus complex, fantasies, etc. And that event is huge in terms of how. So we went from that there was the early roots of a realistic trauma therapy being done back then, to going into psychology that did not focus on real life events. Now I am saying it in a neutral, a kind way. It actually pisses me off.
No, I'm hearing that.
Honest, because it was. I mean, there are books where it's called The Betrayal of the Truth. There is some very, very unpleasant reality connected to how societies relate to these events that are in the shadow.
That's
abuse,
around
incest, homecoming soldiers, you name it. There are so many actually society created trauma that society is very distant from. It becomes the individual's problem.
Well, this
person is weird, right? Yeah. It's not the society. It's the society doesn't own that we have a problem.
That abuse is widespread, that violence against women is widespread, that war fucks people up.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something to be owned, right?
Yeah. I saw Bessel van der Kolk was in Denmark in 2000, 20 years ago, and did a conference on trauma there. And he described that it was still at that time, and I still think it is, that in the States, if you work with domestic abuse, if you work with sexual abuse in families, with incest, etc., you are not going to get a career as a psychiatrist or psychologist or researcher. You're not going to get the money for research. No, and that's where trauma has always been political.
So yeah, I hear you, and I agree with that. There's been a denial of trauma and denial of what causes trauma.
Yeah.
And that's been the traditional sort of conservative way of getting this wrong.
Yeah.
And what I'm now seeing is a
You're
new
the left
movement
wing.
on the left, which is, you know, for example, people saying they're triggered, therefore Mark Walsh has to be cancelled, or whoever has to be cancelled. I've been personally affected by this. And that's the triggering. I'm like, you don't even know what a fucking trigger is. This is the language of trauma you're speaking, right? Like, you know, what is the specific trauma that's triggered here? It's a taking of the, one reason I worry about this, it takes the language away from people who have trauma and makes it into a weapon.
Yeah.
And there is a long history of this on the left as well. Like the communists would say there were mental disorders, you know, that would, you're insane if you don't believe in the communist revolution. And there's a long history of people making things that are political a disorder, and then using this increased care that exists for many of us and not wanting to re-traumatize people and wanting people to have to heal, and using that as a form of control. Now that strikes me as something quite new from the stuff you've talked about, which I think I completely agree with. It's on the other side of the street.
I get that. It's and I think what you talk about, for me, it's addressed, or one of the concepts that addresses some of it is this trauma centrality concept.
Identifying as that.
It's an over focus on it. And with that, starting to use it in different ways, which is really not honoring the true pain of it.
Doesn't honor it, and I don't see it moving towards healing either, because there's
it doesn't.
Hey, if this is useful for me, why would I get rid of it? If I get victim points for this, if I get to control people with this, why would I let go of that? Yeah. So
that's where you really take it into all these defensive positions or stock social roles. That trauma can be, these stock social roles can be put on top of trauma, right? And protect us against it, or we can get stuck in them, or that's a whole story in itself. And I'm with you, that happens.
Okay, I think we've balanced that out a little bit there. So